Hey everyone, fantastic to be here. So exciting to be here in physical presence. It's been a couple of long years, I have to say, of not being sure whether we're going to have more conferences like this. So it's really special to see so many people gathered together to share and to learn from each other. And I think it's particularly relevant because of the topic we have today, communication. I think pandemic showed us the last few years how important communication is, not just on a personal level, but also with the work environment. And then how versatile we are to come up with new ways to communicate, to figure out new ways to meaningfully connect between each other. And so that's what we hope to cover today, how we communicate within the real life working environment of software development. I've tailored this to an audience of students, hoping that I give you a perspective of what it really feels like to work within a team. I understand that the Academy will help you with the academic excellence, so like learning to code, getting the technical skills, but half of being a developer is actually communicating, connecting with others within the organization, making those meaningful connections to bring code that matters, not just is technically excellent, but fulfills a requirement for the company. And that is a different skill. It's not the skills that you get in software engineering class. And I think I'd want you to get that from this presentation, how you should be prepared to contribute with communication in your first job, in your next job, and hopefully give you the skills to get prepared for that. A big disclaimer, I'm not myself a developer. I'm actually a UX designer. I'm a fairly broad UX designer, so I cover everything from research on to interaction design, and then visual, a little bit of front end. And so I will contribute with that perspective, how designers, engineers, and everyone else on the team works together. It will be great to hear your perspectives as well. Feel free to interrupt during the presentation if you have feedback, or we can do questions afterwards as well. But it will be good to hear how my angle differs from yours. So then, a little bit more about me. I had the privilege to start with in a startup, a fast-growing startup. I joined 5 friends who were setting up a company to help other software companies with UI components. And that grew from 5 to around 500 when I left, in maybe 5 years later. And that was an incredible experience of starting with a tight-knit team where communication was just sitting in the room. And then by virtue of being so small, you know everything that's happening. To an organization that is a fairly large enterprise. It has well-defined departments, it has communication across teams, it has all those formal communication channels that need to be designed for and need to be catered for. So I've seen the whole flow of extreme agile, where communication just works, to an enterprise where you have to plan it. Communication would not work on its own. Unless you invest, it becomes a little bit of a chaos. Following up from Telerik, I had experience in some of the enterprise world myself. So consulted for Microsoft. I was heading UX design for some of the larger banks in Europe, BNP Paribas and Deutsche Bank. I've led UX for BP, and I'm currently with Google. I'm a senior interaction manager in Google. And the enterprise world, again, in terms of communication and how the software development process is structured, is fairly different to what you'd see in startups. You have a lot more rigorous structure. You join in an organization that has already introduced some ways of working. And then you have multi-level communications. It's not just important to communicate with the teams that you work with, but you have further up and further down the chain of command where you have to bubble up or trickle down information that gets to you. So communication in an enterprise is quite a lot different from what you'd see in a startup. We'll cover both aspects. So as I talk through, I'll kind of highlight how the communication requirements of different setups will differ. But at present, I'm working on this product. It's an internal product that you wouldn't have seen, but most other software developers in Google would have. It's called rollouts, and it's used by others in Google to release their software onto the cloud. And so anything that goes onto the Google Cloud would eventually pass through the system. If you've ever published an app on Google Play, it at some point has gone through my platform. And so I designed with developers the experiences that users will get on that platform, but those users are also developers. And so we've done tons of research on how developers work, what the software development process looks like in different teams, in different branches of Google. And so hopefully that qualifies me to give a perspective on what works, what doesn't work within communication, and give you that sense of what it really feels like to work as a software developer, not just to write code and to apply the algorithms that you're studying, but what does it feel like to be a part of a team. So what we'll cover today, I hope we'll focus on why communication matters, getting you convinced that software development is not all about code. It has a lot to do with communication, with getting out there and reaching out to other partners. Then I'll introduce you to the main players you expect or you might see in your work environment. Who will you be collaborating with? And then give you a few tricks and tips on how you might approach communication. It's a huge space, like getting communication right, so we'll just touch on it. I hope that if you're interested in this, you go out and you search more on the internet, or learn it yourself once you get to a team. So why does it matter? Why is communication important? You might say, why should I invest in communication? I just need to write code. Isn't communication wasteful? And you have quite a few ways of working within the IT. So if you go agile or if you go extremely lean, they will see a big part of communication as waste. So is it worthwhile crafting a document for a week that no one reads? Is it worthwhile spending an hour with 20 others in a room when no one's listening? A lot of the communications that you'd see into a team are, I will agree, wasteful. And so if communication is a waste, should we invest in it or should we just try to minimize it? That's, I think, a very valid point of view, and it's something we want to approach. So let's challenge it and let's see, do we really want communication? Is it important? Why should we be doing it? And so to me, communication is not a goal on its own. It's a way to get some other means achieved. And the ultimate mean for me is success. We can define that really broadly. And I hope get some opinion from the audience. Do we think success is something we want as a team, as a kind of individuals? I see a few nods. So hopefully it's kind of this nebulous concept of success, but let's all agree success is a good thing. We want to get success. And let's check, do we need communication to get there? Let's drill into success. What does success look like? Oh, and I have an interesting movement on my slides. To me, success, very generically defined, means that you're fulfilling a purpose well. And yeah, it's an interesting mishmash on my slide, but imagine the well at the end. And so the thinking there is that within a software company, you will have a delivery of a service that fulfills some purpose. And if you do it well, then you can track that as a success. And to me, fulfill means, in the context of software, writing good code. So you're writing some code to do something that's useful, and to do it well, it means that users must love it. The definition of doing it well is not it's academically excellent, or it's technically amazing, or I like it. It's the audience that it was made for like it, they love it, they love using it. And so to me, that's the definition of success. Writing good code that does something useful and users love it. And so those three pillars, I find, take different skills and they take different expertise to get right. And they can, each of them, go wrong individually in different ways. A good example here, I don't know how many of you have seen this Quibi. It's a service that was intended to act as the Netflix on mobiles. So the thinking here was we're going to produce very short bursts of clips and entertainment, 1 to 5 minutes, and users might reference to them on the go, on the bus stop, in between classes. So whenever you don't have the time to watch a full Netflix series, but I still have like the odd 5 minutes to just kill time. It made a lot of sense, and it won 2 billion as a funding round. So that's a massive amount of money. And it made sure that they compiled this dream team of designers, developers, so like really strong engineering expertise. And they produced great interfaces. They produced a meaningful service that spoke. It looked all right, and it worked well. However, the something useful part of it fell through. Pandemic came in, and then there were no bus stops. There was no break in between classes, and people were all stuck at home. So there was no need for short bites of entertainment. Everyone was stuck on Netflix. And so the whole effort of like excellent technical expertise, good UX design, fell through just because the middle bit, the something useful, was not there anymore. And so what might have been a success, if there's nothing useful that it delivers, even if it's well designed, is ultimately a failure. They had to fall down. There were further problems, so the content they were streamlining was not entertaining enough. They couldn't get the content right. And so that speaks to me as problems in the UX department, where you focus on designs of the interface and of the experience rather than the content. So that means you haven't read the priorities of users well, or you just didn't have the creative powers to create the content. But whichever way it goes, it's a reminder how these 3 bits are really, really separate. So writing good code, figuring out what's meaningful, and figuring out how to do it in ways that users love are separate things. When one of them goes wrong, even if you did your part right, the whole thing falls through. So all those fantastic developers that did good code writing were having to look for jobs after a couple of years. And so that, I hope, gives us a summary for why we have to work together. Why engineering, so the bit that delivers the code, business and product, those that deliver the insight into what markets need and what we can sell out there, and UX, hopefully the guys that help us understand how to deliver that in pleasing ways, have to work together. And the bit that glues them, the communication that makes sure that all these 3 groups work together, is to me the connection between success and failure. So what I'm saying is, at present, it's very rare to have a one-man team wonder. It happens, but it's more the exception. The current marketplace to succeed globally requires both technical expertise, both business expertise, and then design. And those are 3 separate disciplines. You likely have different people working in each. And so if you have different people to pull together and to glue them to direct in the same space, you need communication. And so that's my kind of pathway into, yes, you need communication for success, just because the current landscape is such that it's complex. You can't do it on your own. And when you involve more parties, you need that communication glue to stick it all together. So who are those parties? Who are you likely to be playing with? And so I see a little bit of mismatches on my slides, but I hope that it will still make sense. It feels a little bit of a puzzle, but hey. Okay, so to fulfill a purpose well, and write good code that does something useful, that users love, we have engineering, business product, UX design, communicating. So when we say engineering, you don't just usually have a single team of developers. Normally what happens is you have sub-teams, particularly if you go into the enterprise world. You have architecture who will be deciding on what the landscape of the system would look like, what systems will interact, what the database would look like, what are the flows of both data and functionality across the different stacks. And then you might have specialization around front-end and back-end, so different teams delivering the interface and the APIs or the services that work beneath them. You might have separate infrastructure teams, so a team that will purely focus on how do we deliver this on the network, what cloud providers or what servers do we need to meet the demand we expect from users. And you might have different separate testing QA teams. You might have separate teams for support to alleviate the first and second level of support before it hits developers. So all of those could be a single team in a startup. It could be ultimately one person in an extreme startup. But the further out you go into enterprise, the more you would see each of these as its own separate team. And so communication across engineering, when we say engineering needs to communicate with business or with UX, it isn't just one team communicating with another team. It's effectively 5 or 6 teams communicating across each other. The same holds true for design. So when we say UX design, we don't just understand one UX designer. In my team, for example, I have a team of researchers. So I have a couple of researchers who will just be talking to users, figuring out the fundamental insights on what they need, how they approach the problem space we're into, or testing out hypotheses that we as designers have put up, and we want to figure out whether users comprehend and feel intuitive. So research is a separate team within the enterprise. Interaction design, its own team of designers that will be ideating and bringing research insights into interfaces. Visual design, a very separate skill. So at Google, we utilize the Google material guidelines for visual design. Content writing, so I have a content writer who will really focus on in our case, it's around tone of voice and how you word out documentation, how you word out error messages, how you word out the interface in ways that are meaningful to developers. But in many other applications, so in Quibi's case, it would be how you create exciting movies. So that can be content as well within the context of UX. Content writing, motion design, if you're using that. So there's like a ton of expertise. The further you go into enterprise, the more specialized you get. And you might be getting like 5 or 6 teams talking to 5 or 6 other teams within engineering. The normal communication, now this is going to be a gibberish with the slides mismatch, but I hope you get that. So normally what might happen on a good, kind of design-driven approach to software development is business or product reaching out with a market niche. So they've identified a market need. They're coming into research and they're saying, can we explore this need with users? Can we figure out whether it's realistic? Can we figure out whether users really relate to that? And researchers would figure out who the right users are, and then you get a lot of communication that brings users closer to both design and engineering, so we understand whether the needs that we've identified are real. An important stakeholder, once we get that verified, the insights from users would be brought into ideation. So how do we create some meaningful experiences to surface those market needs with those user audiences? From there, you'd start thinking around what architecture, what front-end and back-end would surface those interfaces usefully. What do we need to get that into reality? And then you have a lot more detail into how do we brand this, how do we tone the voice here, do we need motion? On the engineering side, what infrastructure is going to support this, what testing we're going to do, what support we're going to put in place. So it becomes this massive gibberish of communication, frankly. And how do you handle that? How do you make sure that none of it goes wrong and it's all orchestrated? Interestingly, the usual response is you just add more to it. So normally project management comes in and it's saying, well, we're going to try and just coordinate it all. And sometimes it works, sometimes it just introduces yet another node in the communication part, so the complexity just becomes bigger. But so hopefully that gives you kind of an overview of what the professional workplace might look like and who you as an engineer might have to communicate with. It isn't just you talking to another designer, it's normally you talking to 5 other engineering teams and talking to potentially quite a few design teams out there as well. Get ready for a lot of communication. So thinking back to the kind of, do we need communication to succeed? I thought of this audience as like tech-oriented, and so I was hoping that quantifying it will work well to kind of bring the message in. So let's try an experiment of figuring out what the formula for success is. How do we get a successful project? So if we say that success is writing good code that does something useful, that users love, then the probability of it should be the kind of function of all these 3 things happening. So it should be a function of the probability of writing good code, the probability that it does something useful, and the probability that users love it. So we kind of agree this is how we define the probability of success. So let's focus on then on what it means to have the probability of writing good code. So we said engineering, writing good code, is not just about one person delivering it. We have good architecture, we have good front end, back end, and we have quite a few other stacks that we need to get right to make sure the code, well, like we abstractly say, good code works. And so effectively, kind of just summarize it, I'll say the probability of writing good code is a function of the success of like n engineering teams. And so we'll extrapolate that, and then the probability of success becomes a function of how successful are n engineering teams, n business teams, and then n UX teams. So we kind of have this as like contributing to the success of a project. But then we said also there's headwinds here. So all of those teams work, pool resources, they make their best to contribute with excellent performance. But then if the communication between them doesn't work, those efforts go to waste. And so what works against, so kind of like dividing or subtracting from the probability of the success, is the probability that communication goes wrong. And notice here kind of the extrapolation of things that go wrong on the communication side. So if we have n engineering teams working together, there's n factorial ways that communication between them can break down. So backend might not talk to front end, and so both might produce fantastic services. You might have a beautiful interface, you might have a really cool architecture behind it, and when you match them, they don't work together. And that's like great success for both teams. They did something technically excellent, but for the outcome of the project, it's a failure. It can't work. It won't do anything. And so that's where there's so many ways in which if you don't talk to each other, things can go wrong, even with the best intent within each team. If both engineering and if both front end and back end work well and they produce something that beautifully orchestrates together, but they fail to register with infrastructure what servers they need, and then the users constantly crash, they can't access the service, there's not enough resource. Is that a success or a failure for the team? Ultimately, the service will not gain traction. So the importance of talking to everyone and embracing that team structure cannot be overemphasized. If you want success for the team, you can't just work isolated, you have to work with everyone else. And so that's not just within the engineering teams. There's also ways in which your communication with UX can go wrong. We might have fantastic intent as designers, we might have these great ideas of what we want to do. If we fail to communicate them effectively to you, if you work towards a different understanding of the interface than what we intend, it's a failure, right? What users would see is not the intent, they'll see something else. And so there's n kind of factorial ways in which this can go wrong, not just for the engineering team, but then the same challenges within business teams not talking to each other, marketing not talking to advertising, UX teams as well, so research not highlighting the user needs to interaction design. All of those things are possibilities of friction. What you end up having is effectively this mishmash, so you have N teams and each of them talks to others. Of course, you wouldn't be every team talking to every other team. Of course, there's like common sense of some teams relate more to each other and you apply common sense on what makes sense as communication flows. But you get the idea of how the number of teams proliferates the interactions required and the communication that you need to invest in. And so when we look at this formula, effectively we have this left-hand side that contributes to success, and it has N unknowns, where N is the number of teams that work on it. But then the risk factors, the things that can go wrong, are N factorial. So the more teams you add to the space, the more risks you introduce for miscommunication and for mismatch. And so there isn't like a project where you just throw more resources at it, and the more teams you add, the faster you deliver, or the better you deliver. There's an optimum size. If you add too many teams, the mishmash of communication becomes such a tangle that they don't necessarily produce more. It becomes, I've seen that on large projects, it just boils down to a grind. And so there's like an optimal level of what a meaningful product space looks like, and often on huge, large products, they would be kind of siloed and artificially divided into scope that is kind of supported by the communication flows. And so from the perspective of an individual team, if you're trying to figure out how do I contribute most to this whole conversation, then what we have is a trade-off where if you invest efforts in your own individual contribution, so if you spend all of your time writing good code, then you can't have the time to communicate with all the other teams. So it's a trade-off. You can't just spend all of your time communicating and not doing what you're supposed to do, but you also shouldn't be just blindly working in the silo and not talking to other teams, because then you have that, you run the risk that your contribution will be not meaningfully integrated in the work. And so where is that balance? Where is that kind of right balance between an individual contribution and a stakeholder communication? There is no formula for that, and it will grossly depend on where the organization is, how far into the enterprise kind of startup versus enterprise, where on that bandwidth it lies, how well the teams are integrated, whether they've already worked together and the communication flows are smooth. There's a number of challenges that you have to consider to get the right balance. But what's important is you consider it. You don't just get into it thinking, oh, I'm going to put all my efforts into producing fantastic code, but you consider what are the stakeholders that I should be aware of, what are the stakeholders that I should be talking to, and then strike the right balance that works for the organization in terms of effort spent communication and effort spent on individual contribution. I'll show you a brief preview of what that means for Google. So I asked for permission from one of our junior developers, and on the left in kind of deep purple, you'd see what their weekly calendar looks like for this week. And so the white bits are optional meetings, so you might attend, you might not attend. Normally, you track those as kind of optional, so you'd probably be working individually through those. But every day, they'll have at least an hour or two of meetings, so that's useful contribution. It's not always just dead time of sitting and looking at the presentation. A lot of those would be pair designing, pair development. A lot of it would be kind of active contribution to a conversation. So expect that whenever, that's a junior designer, junior developer. So whenever you go into a role, you'd spend at least like I'd say 8 or like 20% of your time really just talking and coordination. And that will grossly kind of differ across organizations, but expect that a lot of your time will be spent doing that. And so get ready for it. Effective communication, I think, is so important to software developers. On the right, you'd see my own schedule for this week. Luckily, I had a day off for this event, but then the rest of it is like often fully stacked with meetings. I'd often have back-to-back meetings all day. And that just reflects the kind of the nature of my work, the fact that I'm coordinating work across teams, the fact that I need to communicate with a broad range of stakeholders. A lot of this is not, again, just presentations. A lot of this is co-designing. So I've introduced new ways of working where I stopped producing designs on my own and then coordinating them with developers. We'll sit down on a session and we'll do it together with developers. So we've kind of gone extra agile and like co-designing rather than designing and then iterating. And so that's kind of like my take on it. It will work differently in different organizations, but as you progress in the hierarchy, you'd likely see that communication becomes more important as your expertise wants to be leveraged across a wider scope of stakeholders. So get ready for it. I think a lot of communication is coming your ways, whether you want it or not. And if you prepare for it, I think you'd be better placed for it. So then, why should that matter to you? You might challenge this and say, I'm happy, I just want to focus on code. Even if my team is not successful, if I put in the effort, I should be recognized. And that often is the case. There's many companies that will reward quick failure. The fact that there's failure for a team or a project is not necessarily bad. It could have been calculated risk. It could have been tons of reasons outside the control of the team. And so often within an organization, you can contribute, if you're contributing with honest effort, you will be recognized for it, even if the team is not that successful. However, my experience is, if your team is successful, your own success within it is amplified. So those developers on the SINFO, the failed startup, were looking for a job after 2 years. So even if they contributed meaningful effort, because the team was not successful, they ultimately had to fold. And so if you work on a successful team, you get more resources and you can grow faster within that. And so my advice is, as kind of like selfish to you, communicate so that you can ensure team success, and that team success will drive your own personal success. The other one is around satisfaction. So satisfaction with the output of your work. I've rarely talked to a developer who would be like, oh, I love writing code just for the sake of it. It's always this, I love when the code is being used. I love when I see it in real life, making changes to the world, making impact to users, being used and making a difference. And you can't have that difference if you just spend time writing that code. You need to put it into a production environment. You need the support of backend. You need validation from business. You need that kind of team effort to get that real life impact. And so for me, if you just stick in there, putting in the effort without the communication, you have a lot more chances that you produce technical excellence without real life impact. So if you're motivated by real life impact, communicate. And then the last kind of enticement for me is the chance for visibility and impact. So communication is effectively your gateway to advertising. You can showcase to the rest of the organization what you've done, what your individual contribution is, and you have a chance to contribute to efforts elsewhere. So whenever you're talking to a designer, it isn't one-way communication. It isn't a designer telling you what the world looks like. It's always this dialogue where you contribute your understanding for users, and you have a chance to shape the solution from a design perspective as well. And that to me is so gratifying. We don't want to be siloed. We don't want to be just doing one thing. We want to have impact across the organization, and communication is the way you do that. And so those to me are kind of my top reasons for how you, for why you should be kind of thinking of communication as a really important aspect of what a software developer does. And so how do you do this? How do you communicate, if I've convinced you? So my first tip would be, do it actively, prioritize communication. Don't just rely that you'd start at a work environment and someone will tell you have to speak to this, and this person. If you have fantastic product management and like project management, then maybe you will have that. But sometimes I've seen projects where people don't even know who everyone else is. And so you having that proactive approach of understanding the team structure, sitting down for a half hour and figuring out within what I do, who else should I be talking to? Do I need access to UX? Do I need access to infrastructure? What are my audiences of interest? And then making sure that you have the right communication channels with them. They could be ad hoc meetings, they could be regular meetings, it could be any ways that you reach out to them. But being seen to be proactive about it is such a great way to make inroads into your first job. I couldn't emphasize more. Don't just go in there and assume that someone will curate the experience for you. Have that framework to explore what the organization looks like and how and figure out your own communications plan, what you need from the organization to deliver within the team. Then constantly challenge it as well. Once you have those meetings in place, every meeting you should consider, do I have an update? Do I have something meaningful to contribute? If there's nothing, then should we cancel the meeting? Should I really have invited this other person to this meeting? If they're not relevant, am I wasting people's time? And so try and keep agile. Talking about communication is not all about just do more of it. It only works when it's effective. Inefficient communication is just so demotivating. Sitting through a meeting or writing a document that no one reads, it's just mind-numbing and no one wants to do that. So challenge it, just do the bits that matter. And the last advice is around how you communicate. There's often, what we focused on is the need to just meet and talk to others. But often what happens is, yes, you would meet and you just wouldn't get along. And so front end and back end might be meeting, they might have a communication channel, but they might just hate each other. And so how do you kind of evolve communication in ways that promote cooperation rather than confrontation? To me, it's kind of having that maturity to understand that when people challenge you, it often isn't around your own personal contribution. It's likely around a user need or an objective outcome. When you position communication not as personal attack, but as an objective kind of user-driven change, things become less personal. People don't get affected, and then you can avoid kind of the personal conflict that often follows with communication. And so that's my strategy when it comes to UX design, in particular when I'm doing design critiques. It's never the case of, oh, I don't like this design. I don't think this color is right. It's always like, what would the user want to see? Why is this color not right for the user? Why would this solution not be optimal for this use case? Whenever you present the problem as not my own opinion versus yours, but as an objective kind of like, this is best practices for code writing, and this is why this falls short of it, or this is a better approach, then you have that kind of space to create objectivity rather than subjectivity, and to keep the conversation open. Better, well, kind of like easier said than done, but that's at least like an aspiration that could help point in the right direction. So that's really it. I hope that we've covered good examples of why communication matters to the success both of teams and of you personally as future software developers. Hopefully you've seen some previews of who you'd be talking into a real-life environment, and hopefully we've kind of scratched the surface of what effective communication looks like. I hope this kind of just gives you the importance of the soft skills you need to develop through your studies. Believe me, it really isn't that all about like how good you are at coding. I touched with a few developers on my team when I was preparing for this talk. They said like probably half of the importance of how they contribute to the team is communication. So they place the importance of communication versus technical skills around like equally. That's what they thought was what was helping them progress within the organization. And I think that's a fair assessment. Without communication, you might be technically excellent, but you'd likely have little impact on the organization, and you would be less rewarded for it. So that's my message to you, a really strong message. Don't just do the coding, learn to work with each other. There's so many opportunities in an academic environment to structure team efforts. And all those frustrations that you'd probably do on a team project, that's helpful. That's what you'd see in real life as well. And so going through them actually is helpful. So I know it might be frustrating, but it's also it ultimately serves a purpose. So yeah, that's it. Hopefully this was interesting, and I'm very open to conversation on challenges, thoughts.
Thank you, Zhivko. Any questions for Zhivko?
Thank you very much, Zhivko. I actually have one question. So, how was communication affected, like when COVID appeared in our lives? So, was it difficult at the beginning? Did you need to change anything in your work? How was it?
So at the time, I was working with BP, and we had an interesting structure. Most of product and all of UX was in London, and then software development was split between London and Barcelona. And with COVID, which came really suddenly, no one was prepared for it. The switch was seamless, so we just from 1 week started working from home. When we reevaluated it a month later, we figured that the velocity of the team has increased. And generally, the communication was improved. When we analyzed it, it turned out that because we had that silo of kind of team leads and project management stuck in London, a lot of the communication was happening informally, on the water cooler, on meetings. Even when Barcelona was included in a meeting room, you'd have one TV with like one person from Barcelona and then 5 others in the meeting really like interacting physically. So it just wasn't fair to Barcelona. It was kind of just London-centric. They were excluded in ways that we tried not to, but just because physical presence versus virtual presence is never the same thing, I think they weren't getting the right share of attention. When we switched to everyone virtual, everyone was just dialing in from home. And so suddenly Barcelona became first-class citizen in ways that we thought was fantastic. So to me, on my personal experience, virtual is incredibly powerful in democratizing the communication, because in the offline world, there's often this like, who do you know, who do you meet on the corridor, do you sit next to your team lead, kind of those intact, kind of very subtle things that give you advantages. And then in the virtual world, everyone's equal. You dial in, you have that square on the window, and it's all very democratic and very equal. And yes, it's less efficient than physical. The ways you communicate in the room are to me unrivaled. But that advantage of democracy, I think it's incredible, and just results in so much more inclusivity. I think that it's an opportunity on the whole. So to me, it's actually something we'd like to keep. And now as we're returning to the office, we keep that. So everyone now going into the office in Google will also dial in with their personal laptop, so they're also present equally on the virtual space. And so I think that physical presence now will change to accommodate the advantages that we saw with virtual.
Any further questions?
So thanks in advance for the presentation. Very well explained. I really liked your approach, tackling many different parts of the whole structure and speaking about in principles and in purposes. So regarding to that, I had a question that I was thinking about during the presentation, that is, when the engineers are working on a specific solution, problem, or way of structuring things, is it important that they have the holistic view of the impact that they will have on the work of others, or is it something that is not very important at the first place, and then as problems come up, you then adjust?
I firmly believe it's incredibly important. I'll give you a specific example. So when I work with developers, we'll show some interface and say, I'm showing one number on my interface. And that number, I'm being told, requires like querying a large data set. So you have to like do a long query, and it's going to take a massive amount of computational effort to get it. So without, as a developer, if you know that this interface will be shown once a month, and the users will take use half an hour to review it, then you would develop that query in one way. It might take like 5 minutes to load, there might be a loading time, you would not optimize it. If you understand that this user journey is every day, it's like a toothbrush user journey. Like 5 people come every day, they're gonna do it 30 times today, and you need to show it instantly, then you would approach the development probably very differently. And so, to me, without knowing the full picture, when you're developing code, without knowing how it will be used, it's just doing it blindly. There's so many ways to write code, and without understanding how it will be used, you'd probably choose something at random, and that might not work. It's so important to know the context, the frequency of use, how often it will be used, when it will be used. And then the other bit is, as like the designers, we don't understand the numbers. So I might be trying to show that number, and in my mind, that's a very meaningful number. So I'll give you an example. The other day, I was trying to show the number of failed releases, for example. And so we have that number of failed releases that I thought was, well, I mean, these releases have failed, we're going to show them. And so when the user understood that that will be used by other software developers to track progress across their stack, they're like, yes, but actually, what's failed is unrepresentative, because you have a few stalled that are paused. They're not yet failed, but likely they will fail. And so if you're just looking at the failed ones, you're kind of giving the wrong picture. That is the level of technical detail that I don't have as a designer. So I want that challenge from a developer. I want you as developers to understand what I'm trying to do, because the way I'm doing it might be wrong. And you have kind of that knowledge to really test whether what I'm doing is right. And without that check, I feel really unconfident if I'm working with developers that don't know the domain. I'm like, oh, I'm designing a little bit blindly. And so it's really, I can't emphasize more how important it is for both developers and designers to have the full context. Otherwise, you're probably getting things wrong.